Welcome to another episode of 5-Minute Theology. Today we're going to be trying to answer the question, what is God's glory? If I were to pick a random group of Christians and I were to ask them the question, what is the purpose of the church? I would more than likely get one of two answers, either make disciples or glorify God. And neither one of those is wrong. So since God's glory is so important, it's worth defining. And one of the things we have to remember is, one, God's glory is all over the Bible. Here's some verses. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31, Paul tells us to do all to the glory of God. In Romans chapter 3, verse 23, he says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. In Hebrews 1:3, the author says that Jesus is the radiance of the glory of God. In Ephesians 1:12, it says that Christians are to the praise of His glory. So we can't understand creation, sin, Jesus, or the Christian life without divine glory. So it's a really important concept. It's a word we always say, but it's a word we rarely define, and that's because it's sometimes kind of hard to define. So to begin, we need to understand that God is not a hermit. God does not isolate Himself. God loves to express Himself. So you could think of it like this. Before God created the universe, the Father was expressing His love to the Son, and the Son was expressing His love to the Father. When God created the universe, He expressed Himself again. He expressed His power and His love and His majesty and His goodness. And when God saved the world in Jesus and raised Him from the dead, He expressed Himself yet again. He expressed His mercy and His holiness and His power and His faithfulness. Those attributes and those perfections of God are always being displayed when God acts toward the world. So the most basic definition of God's glory, the first definition we could come up with, we're going to add to that, is God's beautiful self-expression of who He is and how He is. Now in the context of creation, we just call that revelation. He reveals Himself. But you could think of it like this. In the Bible, there is no such thing as incommunicable glory. In other words, God's glory is always being communicated to someone or something. But I think a better definition was given by John Piper, who talks about God's glory a lot. He says it's this: the radiance of His holiness, the radiance of His manifold, infinitely worthy, and valuable perfections. Typical Piper giving us a ton of adjectives. So it's not just God's self-expression, it's not just the revealing of attributes, it's the splendor or the magnificence of those attributes. So you could think of the word beauty or the concept of beauty being a near synonym to glory. Not the same thing, but very close. In the Hebrew, the word for glory, kavod, means weight or heaviness, but it's not just God's power, it's the proportion and the symmetry and the perfection of God's nature. It's how God radiates His perfections, as Piper would say. In Psalm 29, verses 1 through 2, David says, ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due His name. Worship the Lord in the splendor of His holiness. So there's one more thing I want to add to Piper's definition. Piper's definition is great, but I would also add that glory doesn't just include the beauty of all of His perfections. His moral perfections comprise the heart of His glory. In Exodus chapter 33, verse 19, when Moses tells God, show me your glory, check out what God says. I will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim before you my name, the Lord. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. So when God shows Moses His glory, He shows him His goodness, and He declares His grace and His mercy. So the glory of God is the radiance and the beauty of God's perfections, but the moral beauty of God, His character, you might say, is the real treasure or the heart of divine glory. And what do we see at the cross? God's character, God's love, God's grace, God's mercy. And that evokes praise from us. We glorify God because we're telling God just how beautiful and awesome and worthy He is. And that's the essence of the Christian life.